Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we're going to take a look at another interesting topic about life on the Boeing 787. This time we're going to look through what we do in the cruise on such a long flight and on a long haul machine like this. What's different from flying on the Airbus and short haul aircraft that you may have flown in the simulator before, and how do we entertain ourselves for 12, 14, 15 hours in the cruise on these fantastic machines. There's actually quite a lot to be getting on with, and I'll talk through that today, and it's quite different to what we would have done on short haul. It's a different sort of mindset, a different perspective on things. So we're going to look through that, and I'm going to give you all the little insights into what we might be doing in the cruise. I am a real-world airline pilot, but as usual, none of this is for any real-world use. It's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. If you've been watching this channel previously, you'll know that I am a real-world airline pilot. I was previously flying the Airbus A320 aircraft and have now switched over to flying the Boeing 787 Dreamliner on long-haul routes. I have previously done tutorials on the Boeing 787 cold and dark through to takeoff, a detailed takeoff tutorial and a climb tutorial to give you all the tips and advice on how to get this airplane up to this point, as we're just now establishing in the cruise for today's video. Do please watch those videos. They'll definitely help you out at reaching this point and give you some idea of the vertical modes of the Boeing 787, including how to climb it, which is actually surprisingly different to the Airbus A320. Right, let's get started in the video. So here we are just leveling off in the cruise, and the modes are changing to speed, lateral navigation and VNAV path. That's exactly what I would expect it to say for pretty much 99% of the cruise. So we want it to be in lateral navigation following the magenta line, and we want it to be in VNAV path, which is strange because we're actually expecting to stay at the flight level 380. It won't change flight level unless I tell it to, but even so, the mode is called VNAV path. That's where we sit for 99% of the flight. The only time we'll change from VNAV path will be if we want to change flight level. As you can see here, SC, step climb, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Today I've actually loaded up on an actual long haul route, slightly different from our previous tutorials. So I've loaded in a flight using SimBrief from London Gatwick, Echo Golf Kilo Kilo, to New York's JFK, Kilo Juliet Foxtrot Kilo. This route takes us obviously over the Atlantic Ocean and certainly qualifies as a long haul flight. Now, what you can see is that we have a fair way to go until our next waypoints, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff we would do as we arrive at the top of the climb. Now, there's not so much that we have to do as there is on the Airbus in a strange way. We don't actually run through a systems check when we get to the top of the climb in the 787. It's such a well-monitored aircraft that it's expected to bring anything to our attention, although to be fair, the Airbus would do that as well. More to the point, I will set the transponder to below, just like we would on the Airbus, although it isn't modelled on this model at the moment. But there we go. Well, by the way, this is in the Horizon Simulation 787-9, although applicable to all 787s. As I always say, they are very standard aeroplanes. So the things that we're really looking to do as soon as you get to the cruising stage is try and optimize everything for the rest of the flight. So that means making sure that we're going to be at the right level. This is a long flight and we don't want to sit there burning fuel at the wrong level for hours at a time unless we really have to. So it's worth knowing what level you want to be at. To do that, we're going to look into the CDU. Make sure on the FMC com page and wind you have loaded in the winds. If you have this little W, it means the winds are there. If you don't have that, and this feature does work on all of the 787s, what you do is you click wind and then requests. Once you've hit request, you then load it in over here. Then you go back to FMC com, go to climb and click load, and then FMC com descent and click load. So you have to do it for all three stages. Once that's in, you can see the airplane knows what the wind is at different flight levels, and now it can come up with an optimum level for you. You can then go to the VNAV page and see the optimum level there. So at the moment it's 375. We are heading west, so we need to be on an even flight level, so 380. The real aircraft would actually have a recommended level as well, which is just confusing, frankly, but it does have a recommended level, which is actually the one we would go for, but without that there, optimum will be the one you want. Maximum, you don't want to go above that. I wouldn't go too close to it either, so at 404, I probably wouldn't go above 390, and obviously in the direction we're going, as we're going west, we have to be at even anyway. So that's the first thing you're going to start doing. Also, you want to make sure on the init ref index performance page, you have the step size set to 2000. You can even set it to 1000 if you like. Why do you have to do this? Well, the 2000 is because going this direction, as I said, we have to be at an even level. So the next level we would go to is flight level 400. So we want to make sure the airplane has the option to choose that. So 2000 feet is the usual sort of margin that you're going to need in there. Now, of course, whilst all this is going on, we're also going to be doing our usual short sort of flying, where we are talking to air traffic control using the VHF frequency. As you can see here, we have VHF, HF, SAT. It's 3 different ways of talking, then cabin and the other modes. So VHF, very high frequency, is used for short range communications, and that's how we talk with controllers flying around Europe and short haul flights. Once we go over the ocean, we'll talk to them on HF, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. So for now, we sit in the cruise, we let the airplane fly in LNAV path, and you can see a step climb coming up, S/C. If I go into the legs page, we'll actually see the airplane has gone from flight level 380 here up to flight level 400 here. So that's where it expects to climb. It wants to climb there. Now, that seems pretty reasonable and is going to be the most efficient way to do it. However, we're going to move on to the oceanic side of things now. If you look on the chart, you actually see we go over the water a lot of the time. And if I zoom in, you can see here that we enter the oceanic area at Malot. So this is the Shannon control area, and then this is the Shanwick oceanic area. So Malot is where we're going to enter that airspace. So what would we have to do in preparation of arriving at that airspace? Well, it's a whole process, and airlines will have their own procedures for this. But things that typically need to be done is we would have to send off using CPDLC, which is not modelled in here at the moment, which is a way of talking to air traffic controllers through text. So you would go to the COM menu and you would send off a request to air traffic control for an oceanic clearance. In that request, we're going to tell them the flight level we want, the speed we want to fly, and the maximum flight level we can fly as well, and what time we're going to get to Malot. So as you can see here, the airplane is telling me 1619 Zulu. That's when it thinks we'll arrive there. If I go to menu and click data, it will disappear. So make sure you have data selected and you'll see your oceanic entry time. It's important that they know that, because once we go over the ocean, they don't typically control us like they do when we're in short haul. The way they separate airplanes is by sending you all off at the same time, at set time intervals. So they know that as long as you have a set speed, because they know your speed, and they assign you a speed, and you have a set time of starting, then you'll stay separated from the other aircraft. That's how they are allowed to have us closer than they used to have us. Also, we have navigational accuracy and so on that is much improved. So Mallet 1619Z, you tell them that. I tell them we want to be flight level 380, and I want to be doing our planned speed. Now, let me have a look. Our planned speed is a little bit low here. I don't actually think it would be like this. I've been in Costanex 22 and it's showing a 7.9. That's a bit slow. I would normally expect to be cruising faster than that. Econ speed is .848. So quite why it's deciding it's to sit here as it is at 380.8478. I don't fully know. Now, due to the way I've set up the video, something strange has happened with the speed management. You can see here on the cruise page it wants to do .848. That's what it should have gone for. It's actually going slow. It's trying to do 250 knots, so it's keeping us at .79, which is survivable, but at a much slower speed than we would normally cross at any serious distance. We tend to fly around at about somewhere between .8 and .8586. Anyway, there we go. So yeah, as we now enter the oceanic point at Mallet, we would have got that clearance back to us, and in that clearance they would tell us the flight level, the speed that we need to fly, and the time of arrival that we've told them, and they'd also then give us the routing. So you can see here it's actually coordinated waypoints, they're coordinates all the way through to the exit point. And if we look on our charts, we can back that up. So Mallet, and then 5320, 5330, 5340, 5050, and then Elsir as we enter the Gander, not New York, we're not there yet, and that's when you enter the VHF range again. Now, what happens once you reach your oceanic point? Let's say we've got the clearance, we agree with it all, and we're happy. Then we would, as we reach the Mallet waypoint, we actually stop using VHF, and they would tell us an HF frequency, again not modelled here, high frequency, much longer range, and we would use that to check in with the oceanic controllers. They'll be they're located at Shanwick and Gander, and there's also the Bird FIR for Iceland up there, all with HF capability. So what we would do is we would tune in the frequency we've been told. You have a backup frequency as well, because they tend to be quite unreliable depending on the weather and so on, and how busy they are. We would then call up the controller and just check in, and then they would do what's called a cell call check. They will send us over that frequency a little bing bong, an alert. That then appears down here on the HF button, it says cell call, and it would appear up here on the ICAS. You then check that that does come through, and as long as it does, you say, yep, cell call's all good, and then we don't need to monitor the frequency. HF frequencies aren't like VHF. To hear anyone on them, you have to just be constantly listening, so you get all the background noise and static. So it's not very convenient for long flights. So that's why you have this system where you don't actually have to listen to the frequency. As long as you've checked it works, you can then turn it off, and they will call you through the frequency. It goes bing bong, and then you will answer that directly. It means they're calling your aircraft specifically. That is what this little code is for, this cell call code, Hotel Sierra Kilo Romeo. That is the code that they will use to contact this specific aircraft. So you check it works, and then you can just use that when you're in the cruise. These days, air traffic control will typically not do that. They'll actually just use CPDLC to send you a message. On the 787, that will appear in a nice window right here, telling you exactly what they want you to do. So they tend to send you things like, you can now resume normal speed, which means you can actually change your speed by a little bit if you want to, though you don't typically want to because you'll have flight planned for a certain speed. They might say to you, you can climb higher if you like. They might ask, will you climb higher because the airplane beneath you wants to climb? Because you could have an airplane 1,000 feet beneath you waiting for you. It's one of the perks of the 787 is that because of that nice big wing we have, we actually can climb higher than most aircraft can early on in the flight. It means we tend to get the higher level for ourselves, and then we can sit there and climb when we want, and the airplanes below sometimes get stuck beneath us. It's one of the perks of the 787. It's got a beautiful, beautiful wing. They might send you some other stuff, and also you'll use CPDLC to send them messages saying things like we want to avoid weather and so on. So how would we do that? Well, here's some little things that we do going oceanic. If there's weather ahead and it shows up on the radar, let's say there's weather at the 5320 waypoint, and let's imagine we were already oceanic, so we want to go around it now as we get closer. You wouldn't ever see weather this far out on the radar, it wouldn't work that well, but yeah, you would go to, one option would be to send them a message saying we want to offset. You would usually try and go upwind, so let's say to the left, we want to offset from our route by a certain distance, and then they'll say whether that's okay or not. If you want to actually do that, you'd have to go to the offset key, and that's not here today. There's also another process called strategic lateral offsetting, where we don't actually fly on the same line. Because there'll be several aircraft using this same track. This is a North Atlantic track that is in use on that day. Because lots of aircraft will try and do the same route, we tend to all sit a little bit off the route. It's always off to the right of the route, and it's typically between 1 and 2 miles, so we're all slightly offset, and that way wake turbulence isn't such an issue because no one's at exactly the same place in the sky, which definitely helps. It's a clever procedure. So those are the two things that we might be doing with that. Now, as we're oceanic, we're also talking about ETOPS, which is what we use when we're flying these aircraft long range. It's a system designed to allow twin-engine aircraft to operate for long periods away from airfields and alternate airports. Now, it didn't used to be an issue when we had 3 or 4 engines, and that's why we had those tri-jet aircraft when we had the performance to only need 3 engines, but we still didn't have the reliability to allow only 2. That has now come and gone, and we are now very much in the era of twin-engine long-range operations. It means that the aircraft has to be tested for certain things before it goes, and there's extra procedures to make sure that the engines are very, very reliable. The idea being that if you lose one engine, you can then divert safely knowing that your other engine is very, very unlikely to have any further issues. So what that means is typically you'll have a rating of how far away from an alternate airport you're allowed to be. Now, 787 is usually 180 minutes, although airlines will certify it further and further. So 3 hours, and that's 3 hours on a single engine, remember. So it's quite a long way, something in the range of 1,200 nautical miles. So what airfields are we going to use for that today? Well, it will be on your flight plan. This has to be planned to be within that range of these airports. Although remember, it is still air. You need to be careful with that. So typical on a routing like this would be Shannon, which is an airfield on the west coast of Ireland here, EINN, because it has to be a relatively big airfield with the fire capability and the runway to handle a heavy aircraft like the 787 or so on. So typically, to cross the Atlantic, you'd have Shannon over here, and you might have one of the airports here in Gander or Newfoundland ready to accept you on the other side. You may also, if you go further north, let's say you're heading to West America, you might use Iceland up here if it's available, and even Greenland on a really nice day, depending on the weather. You can find that the weather in some of these airports isn't good enough, so you end up using airfields further south, down here in the Santa Maria zone. And if you head to South America, of course, you have a lot more ocean around you. You might find that you're using airfields in the Caribbean. A ring is a surprisingly long way away. The range you can go is much further than you'd imagine. So even if you just use Shannon at one of these airports here on Newfoundland, they easily intersect those two so that the ranges, so you're actually always covered and legal ETOPS wise. So that brings me to the next thing we would do, which is gather weather for these airfields. Are they available? Are they suitable? Is there a good runway we can land on? And are we happy that they are usable as an alternate? ETOPS is a planning exercise. It doesn't mean it's valid in flight. In flight, we do what we think is safest. So it doesn't matter that Shannon was the airport we planned to use as ETOPS. If it's no good or we prefer somewhere else, then we might use that one instead. So it's typical for pilots on long range to press the fix page, type in the airfield, EINN, and then put a circle in. If you put slash, let's say 800, it will draw an 800-mile range ring around that airport. Let me just move the ICAS over so we show you better. And there we go. There's Shannon and there's our range ring. If we then put in the next airport that we're thinking about using, so for example, let's say Keflavik, BIKF, I'll press next page, BIKF, and do another 800-mile ring. There we go. And there you can see we're well within the 800 miles, which isn't even the ETOPS range of this aircraft, you know. If we were to then put in one of the Canadian airfields on the other side, so let's put in CYYT, which is over on there, the other side of Canada, and 800s. And now you can see these rings, we're completely covered the whole way. And obviously if these were 1200 we'd be covered as well. 800 is a little bit short of the normal sort of 3 hours range, although remember with the wind it could be different. Now don't get misled, this could not be the best plan. After all, the wind is pushing us back towards Shannon, so let's say we were perfectly in between the two circles, it might be quicker to return to Shannon than it is to carry on, or it will be in fact. Same for, is the weather okay, is there a volcano erupting in Iceland, you know, this sort of stuff. You need to keep an eye on this. And this is where long haul is very, very different to short haul, and this is a really important point I want to make. If you were to suddenly go, oh, we've got a problem with the engine, I want to divert, and you head off to one of these airfields, let's say you were in the middle of the ocean here, and you decide to go to Keflavik, you set off, and then you realise, oh, the volcano has erupted, and they're only using a short runway with a weird approach, and it's not going to be long enough for us. You could get yourself into real problems because, of course, your fuel situation is going to rapidly change and you may not have enough fuel to then make it back to Shannon. Now, in all likelihood, you would. But my point being, when we do long-range operations like this, you have to be very careful and methodical and calm when you come to these decisions. You don't just dive into some plan because you are a long way and you may only have one or two options at a time. And it's certainly important to make sure you think about them carefully and get to the correct one for your situation. So there we go. That's some of the rings, weather, would have thought about it. So some of the things we might be thinking about at this stage of the flights. Now, speaking of alternate airports like that, we do actually have this alternate page, and in here it has, you can write it in where you're thinking of going. Let's, for example, put it in Keflavik, BIKF, and then it will give you an expected time of arrival and a fuel figure when you get there. Now, you have to be a little bit careful. If you select it, you can actually see that it doesn't know the wind or anything, so you might put in the current wind, 25034, which, by the way, I'm taking from the navigation display, 25034, and you put that in, and then you might not fly there at the current level 370 because let's say we've had an engine failure, so you might be lower down. Let's say we're at flight level 200, and it wants to have the temperature, so let's say it be minus 30. Now if you go back to the alternate page, it should update that time of arrival and the expected fuel. So this page doesn't update very often. It's not entirely accurate because obviously every second these numbers would be changing. You're moving away from one and closer to another. But it is a rough guide, something to consider anyway, potentially useful for planning if you're especially a long way away. So there you go, this is planning to divert from Mallet. So if we wanted to then go to Keflavik, it would arrive us there with that fuel. And then you can hit divert now if you want to. It's rarely used, I must say. Most people would prefer to modify the flight's route to a new airport and just put it in like that. But anyway, that is an option. Good. Now let's move on to talking about the aircraft systems. What do pilots need to be doing to make sure that we're all safe and the airplane is happy as we go on such a long flight. Look at that, you can start to see the water now. We're heading very oceanic, very cool. I absolutely love this part of the flight. So we have here fuel low center. This brings me on to the first thing. This is a normal message, especially on a lower fuel flight, but in fact it happens on every flight unless you didn't have any fuel in that tank to start with. This means that the center tank here is running out of fuel. If I press systems, fuel, the real aircraft would default to the fuel page. You can see there's only 2.2 tons left in that tank. So what do we need to do? It's very simple. If you ever see the fuel low center message, I would bring up that page just to make sure everything's normal, and then you go on the overhead panel to the fuel pumps, center pumps, left and right, off and off, and then they change over on here to the main tanks. The airplane's quite clever, and it will actually now, if there was a bit of an imbalance, let's say, between these tanks, which is not uncommon given how long you may have been flying and how they burn slightly differently, or to do with APU fuel or anything, it will now feed the center fuel into those tanks evenly and balance it all out. It's a very good system, and that's pretty much it. Worth noting, in the real aircraft, the changeover between the center, the diagram is very slow. You turn off the center pumps and the diagram doesn't change over to the main pumps for a little while. It's not a problem. All of these pumps could fail and the aircraft would be able to draw the fuel using gravity, just like the Airbus. It would be perfectly safe. So that's what you do, and then you see that message disappears, and if I press the recall button, it stays disappeared. So other systems checks. Well, speaking of fuel, on the progress page, you would go to page 2 and check that the totalizer and calculated fuel are looking sensible. What this means is the totalizer fuel is this figure here, how much fuel the airplane senses it has in its tanks using condensers and all sorts of clever materials. The calculated fuel is simply the fuel it started with when we pushed back or took off, and minus how much fuel it's used. It knows how much fuel it's used because if I press engine, we can see here it has a fuel flow meter, so it knows what the engines have used, so that number should add up to say something similar to the amount of fuel in tanks. If it doesn't, there's potential for a fuel leak, and that's something we would have to investigate. Fuel leaks are a big thing on an aircraft when you're out over the ocean. It's something we are incredibly aware of, so it's carefully monitored, and the airplane will tell you if it thinks there's a difference between the two, and it's quite interesting to see that system. It actually uses by default the calculated figure, not the actual number in the tanks, which is the reverse of the Airbus, which of course uses the calculated figure for its planning. So yeah, the numbers in the box are done like that. Part of the reason is that the fuel tanks are very big. It's a big airplane and a lot of fuel, but it only has 3 tanks, so the fuel actually moves around a little bit and the sensors can get a bit variable. You can find during the takeoff roll this number changes by 2 or 3 tons as you climb out initially, and then drops back again once you're level. It's designed to be wings level sort of only, so in that sense Boeing seems to think that calculated is a better number to use generally, and they do typically tie up by the end of the flight, although there can be a few hundred kilos between them during the cruise depending on what stage of flight you're at. So that's something we would monitor very carefully. As we cross over each waypoint, we're going to make sure that we have the expected amounts of fuel. If we were gaining fuel, are we still gaining fuel? If we, let's say we have a little bit of extra fuel, but at the previous waypoint we had loads extra, then that might be a concern. Why have we overburnt so much? Remember, the plan won't be perfect, especially on a long flight like this. It's not all going to be clear. By the way, that plan you can just take from SimBrief, and it will actually tell you the fuel expected at each waypoint, just like it gave us the route and it gave us those ETOPS alternates. It shows it in a chart now. It's very good. But yeah, there we go. So that's some of the things we would be doing with those systems on the aeroplane. We're also going to look at the progress page to make sure how we're doing in terms of time of arrival. Progress page 1, time of arrival, and also how much fuel on arrival. Now 6 tons we need to land with. You can see here currently expecting 9.2. That's about right, and I'm just going to make sure this number doesn't change too much throughout the flight. It should trickle one way or the other maybe, but not suddenly change. That could suggest something's happened, or something about the airplane has changed, or fuel's disappearing somewhere in the system. So just another way of backing that up, along with checking each waypoint, checking the progress page. Like I say, we check it a lot. Now, an interesting thing about 787 is it has all these pages, but we don't actually routinely check these. We just don't need to. Boeing themselves don't recommend using these pages for diagnosis. They're just synoptic displays. They give us an idea, but they are not even close to representative of the complexity of these systems in the real machine. For example, this electrical page you'll see here is absolutely hilarious. You have your 2 generators on each side, and then you have the drives from the engine driving the generators. And all this shows me is that, yeah, they're all working fine, and they're feeding the AC buses. It doesn't show you what bus they feed or what systems they feed. It just shows you it like this. It's absolutely brilliant. The hydraulic page is a little more detailed, showing you which pump is being used and what systems or main systems are attached to which parts of the hydraulics. But in general, this is an incredibly redundant aeroplane. You really don't lose many systems. Even when you lose major hydraulics and electrical systems, it's quite remarkable. And remember, it's a heavily electric aeroplane. Things like the wing anti-ice are electric, stabilizers electric, brakes are electric, so we're much more interested in that. But there we go. So we don't typically sit there and go through these. The ones you look at mainly are the fuel. You'll look at the stat page, because sometimes you might see a status message. It will say status up here, and it just means a little maintenance thing the airplane's upset about, and that will be something you'll tell the engineers on landing, and then they can go and investigate or reset a system or whatever they need to do. We can also look at the air page, and you might set the temperature, adjust it accordingly. So 24 is a bit hot, so yeah, it might wind the temperatures down a little bit, and that should change the set temperature. There you go, 23. That's about what I like on the flight deck, and that's about it. Otherwise, back on the ND page. So this is a pretty typical format. Like I say, we're a bit slow. I'd normally be about 8.5, 8.4, but yeah, other than that, that tends to be how you end up finding yourself in the cruise on the 787. If you had a warning or caution, an amber caution up here on the ICAS, you can press the recall button to bring it back up. If it doesn't appear, then there wasn't anything. There you go, and it will tell you recall. So that means it's all clear. The airplane is now happy, just in case that happens. Good. Finally, moving on to preparing for arrival, you're going to get the weather for your airport you're going into. And by the way, if you want to get weather in Microsoft Flight Simulator, you actually can. Press this little cloud tab, and then click METAR, and then choose the airport, and it will show you different airports. So there's our route ones, there's Cork, Kerry. I mean, they're just nearby ones really, but there we go. We can grab the Shannon weather, and it tells you the weather there. So that's something you can do in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is quite fun. But yeah, you're going to grab the weather for your destination, and then you will start coming up with a plan. Now, this is not something you do at this stage. It's far too early. But what you can do is start, or what you would do is start preparing for your arrival by going into here, and there's not many things you need to do. You'll brief your arrival, so brief up your charts and what you expect to fly, which you can do in your approaches and so on. And I'm just going to run through a brief description here. I'm going to give you far more detail when we do our landing tutorial, but there we go. So you might look at the ILS charts or whatever you're planning to fly, or the star charts, and once you've decided on everything, and now we're underway, I can go to departure arrival, index arrival, and then choose. Let's say we're doing the ILS 04 left. I don't actually know the arrivals here, via Lendy, and then hit execute, and then I can go to plan on this navigation display, and then legs, and I can step through, and I'll see, I mean, that's totally wrong. That is not what you'd not what you'd actually end up flying, but there you go. And I can see the route, and I can decide whether I think it's happy, or if I want to modify it, or how I need it set up. So you'd set the route, then I would also go to the init ref page, and it should bring you to the approach ref page, and choose your landing flap and speed. Now be careful here, because in the Boeing, this weight is the current weight. We are currently 195.7 tons. In fact, that's an old weight. In the real one, it does update. So we need to work out what we're going to land with. So just like the Airbus, we have to calculate that ourselves. Progress page, currently landing with 10.8 tons, pretty good actually, of fuel. So that's 25 tons less than what we have now. So I need to take the current weight and take off 25. So 170 tons roughly. So if I put 170 up there, it will now modify these speeds accordingly. So we're going to land flap 25. So you select it. You can also do 30. 20 is only for abnormal situations. And I'm going to put it in there. You'd also do a landing performance calculation, which doesn't work on here, but you'd come up with an auto brake setting. So let's say it's fairly typical flap 25, auto brake 3 would be a pretty normal 787 landing configuration. So you put that in there. And finally, we're going to put the minimums in. So I'm going to wind this to whatever number I think it needs to be, the minimums. Again, I'm going to talk about this in a lot more detail for the actual landing tutorial, so don't worry about that for now. It's just something to show you a few of the things we need to set up, especially for the more advanced people who know how to fly an approach and so on. They might be interested just to see what we would do. Next, you can also preset the QNH in the background. So if I turn this, let's say they've given us a QNH in America of 29064, so I could actually put that below, and then when we change over, I can just press that and it swaps over. Quite a good system, I quite like that. So you'd have that just sitting there ready to go in the background. And that's it really. You have your QNH ready to go, got your minimums, got your approach speeds, you'll have done your briefing, and you've chosen your flight plan. I quite like it. It's quite a simple setup for the arrival in the 787. Oh, here we go, not quite oceanic yet. Still over Ireland. Something I do find interesting about 787 is that even when you have terrain showing, which you do by pressing this, it doesn't actually show you the ground. The A320 would show you the edge, the water, and so on. 787 doesn't. It just gives you this black screen, which I suppose is quite good because it's what's relevant to you, and there's a lot of information on this screen. But I did like the Airbus because it gave you a sense of where you were in relation to coastlines and so on. But I suspect it's something to do with the sheer size of the display. But I don't know. I don't know if the A350 gives you more information or not. Last little bits then to talk about. As we get closer to our step climb point, we might ask air traffic to climb up. Let's say they let us climb to 390. All you have to do is put 390 in the window. You'll see that nothing changes. So then what you need to do is press the altitude button. Press, and it will go into thrust ref, VNAV speed, and it will climb that 1,000 feet. If I go to the VNAV page, you'll see max is 407, so it's absolutely fine. And the airplane will now climb up and then return to VNAV path as long as you're in LNAV and VNAV over here. Or certainly VNAV is most important there if you want to be in VNAV path. That will then clear out this S/C because we've now done this. Oh no, sorry, it won't, because that wants us to go to 400. So I can see on the legs page, actually 410 at 5330. So that's this another step climb coming up there to climb up to 41. 787, like I say, climbs very high very early on. Another thing that's interesting is that as we change over airspace, let me just get rid of this, into Gander, that happens at the 30 west waypoint, which is on our route. If I can find it for you. No, I can't. Oh, there we go. That's handy. So just seeing the level off there, VNAV path returns. Yeah, as we cross 30 west, we'd change over to Gander, oceanic control. What you do then is do another of those HF cell call checks. Other things, of course, that we're going to do is keep in touch with the cabin crew, monitor other aircraft around us, what's going on with the weather and so on. And yeah, there is a little bit of time to eat some food, even amongst all of that. There's time to have a little bit of a chat, but all the while someone will be, of course, carefully monitoring these instruments. That never, ever, ever gets compromised. It's incredibly important. But yeah, there is a chance for everyone to have a bit of a break, and obviously if there's extra pilots, someone will go back in the airplane and have a bit of a sleep. Not sure what just changed there. But there we go. Something to do with the weather loading in, I'm sure. So that's it. I'm sure there's things I've forgotten, but that's a bit of an idea of what you might be doing in the cruise in the Boeing 787. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's been interesting for you. I think it's interesting. It's been a big change to my my way of flying and my way of being at work, to see how we handle this aircraft and what sort of things you do in the cruise. As you can see, there's actually more to be doing than you might have once thought. Certainly there was for me. So there's plenty to be getting on with, and it's amazing how many hours you can spend doing that. The whole process here, from taking off from Gatwick to getting out over the ocean, would probably keep you relatively busy right up until you're properly oceanic. And then once you've gathered your alternates and sort of got your headspace sorted out about where you might be going and what the best options are, you'd start to become in a bit of a more relaxed situation where you'll start thinking about having some dinner or so on. But yeah, there'll be long-haul pilots who watch this and will think differently, and I can only apologise if I've misrepresented something. I aim not to. I hope to show you just a general idea of the sort of things that might be going on, but there will, like I say, be things that I have missed. There'll be plenty more videos and tutorials, including that descent, approach and landing tutorial coming soon, and live streams. So do please stay tuned, subscribe if you'd like to see those. Otherwise, please keep safe and well. We'll see you in another video or live stream soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.